Hey there, it's Silver, and this is my slightly slow video on Borderlands 4. Due to the strange circumstances surrounding how the launch went, it took a bit to get good progress, but here we are. Borderlands is of course the series of looter-shooter action RPGs by Gearbox that are known for their huge variety of guns and also their flailing attempts at humor that sometimes stick. I'm a fan of the series personally, but I think the writing has been getting noticeably worse with each entry. I love the games on a mechanical level, but things like story and characters depend heavily on which game in the series I'm playing. Luckily, in my opinion, the fourth entry has walked back the worst aspects of how the third treated the player and the characters, and feels much more like a return to form for the first two games. Something I should probably get out of the way before I go any further is the elephant in the room, the performance. Sometimes we get games that perform consistently badly for basically everyone. These are often a simpler task for the devs to solve, as they usually have one big thing that's causing issues, and if they fix it, performance improves across the board for everybody. This is what happened with games like, say, Dragon's Dogma 2, for instance. NPCs were causing lots of weird pathing issues and tons of physics calls everywhere they walked, which meant performance and settlements tanked for everyone. Once they alleviated that, it improved on a lot of different systems. Other times, though, we get the inconsistent version of where people have wildly different experiences on hardware that's very similar, or sometimes even having higher performance builds suffering framerate issues that lower spec machines aren't. That's what's currently happening here. This game currently performs very strangely, and it's kind of a crapshoot whether you'll be able to run it properly or not. I only have the one system that I can test it on, as well as a Steam Deck, but that's not currently supported. I think it would melt a hole in the poor thing if you tried. So I can only give my own experiences based on running it on a machine using an RTX 3080, the 2GB version, a Ryzen 9 5950X, and a pretty fast Crucial SSD. On this system, I can run it at just a hair off of maxed out at 1080p and get a consistent 60 FPS. The performance for me is actually really nice, and I haven't had any major issues with running it. The only drops I get happen sometimes when roaming around to new areas. I'll get a little hitching for a second or two. This is called Traversal stutter. But due to the SSD, I don't get this very often, and it's minor when it does happen. I only reduced a few settings to high rather than max, like shadows, and a few post-processing things I don't like, so it actually runs great for me, really. I've only had one crash in all my playtime, and it wasn't during gameplay. Once during shader compilation, after just launching the game, it got to 3% and suddenly crashed. I was never able to reproduce this, and it has never happened while actually in-game. However, there are plenty of people who are having crashes and bad performance, and I don't want to invalidate those experiences. Just know that it's possible your system won't run it like you think it should. But the patches they've put out have noticeably helped, and there's another big one on the way at the time I'm writing this. The only two technical issues I've actually experienced are both weird. For one, it always launches at a higher resolution than my monitor supports. I have a 1080p monitor, but the game launches in 1440p for some reason. It doesn't cause any issues, aside from making my desktop look really funny for a sec after closing the game, but it's annoying that no matter how many times I change it, it just goes right back every single launch. The other issue is that after playing for a bit, strange things can start happening. The GPS pointing you to a non-existent objective, containers becoming unopenable, certain puzzles and chests not wanting to work, and things not spawning or activating their scripting correctly. It seems like the game really wants you to close and restart after about 2.5 or 3 hours of play. And when you do, you'll find that several things are now completely different because they just weren't working before. It's bizarre, but not game-breaking. So, audio-visual stuff. If you've played any previous games in this series, you'll immediately notice something. Borderlands generally uses pseudo-realistic textures beneath a heavy filter that kind of looks like cel shading, but is actually gradient lighting over a comic book effect and a thick black stroke around characters and objects to give it a graphic novel-influenced appearance. This game has changed that entirely. Gone is the heavy concept art-like look and comic black outline, and instead the textures and art are highly stylized science, fantasy, sci-fi kind of deal, with an emphasis on super saturated colors. Gritty sci-fi that doesn't really aim for realism as much as a slightly exaggerated, dingy, cartoonish look. If you look at something like Borderlands 2 to compare, you'll see that that game is very smooth looking, with textures not having loads of detail and instead looking like a shaded art right out of a graphic novel. Borderlands 4, in comparison, has drastically more detail in textures and models, moving away from purely cartoony visuals and more towards gritty and saturated digital art. If 2 was drawn by a novel artist using comic techniques, then 4 is drawn by a digital artist that makes sci-fi stuff, influenced by different games and movies of the genre. It's a bit of a risk to change your entire art style so drastically, especially when the whole series is known to use it. But I actually don't mind the idea. If the artists want to try something different, then go for it. The original game's style isn't going anywhere, so I say go ahead and experiment if you really want to. I think the new style looks great most of the time. The characters get a nice detail boost from it that gives their models and clothes a bit of extra personality. The environments benefit from the large amount of extra detail the most, gives the world some great variety. From super lush forests to blasted wastelands and occupied settlements, the world has a pretty fantastic look that reminds me of browsing for new wallpapers from digital artists. The previous games had an advantage in the smooth world made combat extra readable. You were never having enemies getting lost in the background grit. I think they've managed to import that effect pretty well, if not entirely. The extra world detail doesn't tend to hide enemies easily, and combat remains pretty clear. I think the biggest reason for this is that the detail added in the world textures and the detail added to enemy models isn't the same kind of grit and finish, so they don't tend to blend together. Enemies are generally brighter and their textures are slightly smoother and very colorful, and I think this helps to keep them from easily getting lost during fights. The guns look awesome this time around. The sheer amount of detail and variety and how they look and operate is fantastic. Considering you're expected to collect many hundreds or thousands of these throughout the game and you're going to be looking at them the whole time you're playing, it makes sense to have them be extra satisfying to watch. Firing animations for how everything moves, alt-fire details, reload animations, and even idle bits all look great and add a ton to the weapon handling. While many games go for ultra-realistic weapon use, Borderlands has been more and more focused on making them look exotic and strange in how they work, and I think they've really hit their stride this time around. Considering this is an ARPG, loot is an ever-present aspect to deal with in terms of how it's presented when dropped and in the inventory for browsing through and comparing. All loot has the classic colored columns of light beaming up from it for each rarity, with Legendary being taller than the others and having some extra animation to it. Loot also makes a sound when dropped. Higher rarities have a good sound cue that you can hear no matter how far away from it you are, and Legendaries in particular have an unmistakable sound that hypes you up to go poke it whenever you hear it. Loot also explodes out of things and tumbles out from enemies in a very satisfying way, so it seems like they've really nailed the loot aspect this time around. Oh, by the way, pearlescent items will be returning. They aren't currently in at this moment, but they'll be added in a free update in early 2026. Musically, I think they've managed to make the most of the new world design by having a good number of tracks to fade around as you go through each area that fits the world. We've got a lot of sci-fi and synthesized music, especially pulsing versions of songs for combat, but it also delves into that Old West frontier style that previous games, especially the first two, tended to have as well. For something new to the series, we've also got some of what I'd call post-apocalyptic music that tends to hit in certain areas, especially in areas like the canyon wastelands of a place called Carcadia Burn. This style adds a kind of dark and looming sound, making it feel like a foreboding area that represents the end. I've also noticed that dungeon music is often upbeat and synth-heavy, dying down to a more slow and quiet drone of beats during downtime. Boss music is much more bombastic and varied than most other tracks, and the big story bosses have accompanying tracks that fit them really well, punctuating your fight with them in a way that sounds like a hard-won triumph as the fountain of loot erupts in the middle of the arena. There have been some pretty big changes on the gameplay front, so let's start with the big obvious one. Borderlands has gone fully open world with this entry, something I was honestly a little afraid of, but I think they did it in an extremely good way. In previous games, the world was split into small and medium areas, dozens of them per planet separated by loading screens. In 4, the world, which is called Kairos, works a lot like how the open world of something like The Witcher 3 works. You have one big map separated into different biomes that you can simply drive to whenever you'd like, with no loading screens. There are also small and medium dungeons that you can find without loading, but the larger dungeons are separate areas that do require loading into. The map is pretty huge and takes a while to traverse, but it is absolutely packed with content. When I say content, I don't mean the Ubisoft method of scattering 900 repetitive tasks everywhere in a colorful icon vomit. I mean there's actually stuff to find and do that doesn't obsess over being a content checklist. Another comparison to The Witcher 3's world is that although there are tasks which repeat, much of what you find is unique, and the things that do show up multiple times tend to change themselves around enough to not feel like you're simply doing the same thing over and over. I think that one of the best aspects of the new design they went with is how well they've made the world not repetitive and filled with content that you actually want to do, instead of feeling compelled to do it to complete a grocery list. You'll find lots of areas that are filled with enemies and just sort of represent organic fights that you can go and get into if you want. You don't have to clear them because they're one of 84 outposts you gotta clear. They're simply areas with loot that you can optionally fight through if you want. Even though there are lots of these, they all have very different layouts and threats and don't feel repeated, making them fun combat sections to wade into just because you can. They'll have some chests for you to find, as the game is generally good about rewarding the player for their actions. Some of them will have a really nice chest with red chains around it. If you completely clear the area, the chains will turn green and then explode off when you get close in a way that scares the crap out of your cat and allows you to get the juicy gun meat inside. Some of those larger bases will even have entrances to big dungeons in them. Many of these will be locked until a story mission takes you to them, but others are actually for side missions instead. Some other stuff you'll find are these silo things. They're a tower you can get into, but the real puzzle is figuring out how. You'll often need to explore around a bit to find the opening. Often they're significantly above you at the back of the tower, but some of them even involve like jumping puzzles to reach. When you take these, you get some vending machines, and the silo itself launches a big balloon you can grapple onto for long-distance gliding around the map. There are also bases you can take over. They'll have plenty of enemies in them when you arrive, but if you manage to survive the waves, that's when the real difficulty starts. All of these have a tablet with some info you need to officially take the base, but each base has their tablet in a different location. These range from pretty simple to locate to where the hell is it, I've looked everywhere. As a quick tip, if you're having trouble finding one, resist the usual urge in games to look up for it and start looking down. I found several that were much lower than I thought they even could be. Once you have it, you just access the terminal thingy and take over the base. This will give you plenty of chests and things, vending machines, and even a fast travel point, and a contract board to take random replenishing missions for rewards. Taking these is basically securing a foothold in the area. They're key to exploring the map. As for other stuff you might find, there are different collectibles that give rewards, like very well hidden bobbleheads and vault symbols, as well as these artifact things. You poke them, and they send out 3 beams that spawn golden orbs. You gotta make it to all 3 and then return to the artifact for your reward. There are several other kinds of events and places you can find, but it all means that the world has a lot to reward you with. Completing all these, as well as the other rewards you get, will also give you some SDU tokens, which you can spend on expanding your inventory, ammo capacity, your bank, and even the lost items machines. Traversal is the best it's ever been in the series this time around. You start the game with a double jump, which is already great, but soon after you'll also receive a grappling hook and a glide. You are much more mobile this time around, and due to the environment design, you're expected to use this mobility all the time. Your glide is interesting because it doesn't just make you fall slower, it also boosts you in whatever direction you're facing at a pretty good speed. It's really satisfying to weave around in the air, shooting things and making curves as you swoop down to cover. It gives you excellent air control, so you can use it to move around quite precisely once you get the hang of it. It has a gauge that depletes as you use it, and you'll fall out of the sky if it bottoms out, although this is Borderlands, so no fall damage. The gauge is good for 10 seconds of gliding, and once you land, it'll refill in 5. The grapple can be used for quite a few things. You can use it to grapple up to higher places, and also to swing back and forth on some points. You can also use it to pull destructible things into your left hand, so you can toss them at dudes. There will be times when you need it to remove pieces of things or rip open gates and doors, and it has a pretty long range, so you can really mess around with it in battle. The one thing I wish you could do but can't is pull loot into your inventory at range, but I'm guessing the range targeting of a specific weapon on the ground would probably be a nightmare. There are also a couple things you can do that the game doesn't do a very good job of letting you know about. You can ground pound if you crouch in midair. You'll sometimes need this for puzzles to activate floor switches or break things. You can also dash. If you tap sprint while moving in any direction but forward, then you'll quickly dash in that direction. If you tap it in the air, then you'll dash forward in the air. It takes half of your glide gauge each time though, so you can't spam it. All this extra mobility has to be designed for in the combat arenas and world design, and I think they've done a solid job of doing just that. When you give the player this much mobility, you want them to be expressive with it, to be able to match their playstyle with their particular brand of running around like they're on fire. In exchange for all this, the enemies are often more mobile as well, and every faction also has flying enemies of various kinds to bother you with, and they do. Some other big changes are in your gear. For one, you don't have a grenade mod slot anymore. You have something called an arsenal slot. Instead of finding mods, you find the full grenades and put them here. Everything in this slot is cooldown and charge based. It doesn't use ammo anymore. You can also find other types of throwables like satchel charges you can detonate remotely, or throwing knives that do surprisingly massive damage. But you can also put heavy weapons in this slot. Originally, you just put those in your weapon slots, and they used heavy ammo. Now they go in this space and recharge on a cooldown. There are also many more types of heavy weapons than before, including things like laser cannons, energy disc launchers, and multi-barrel autocannons. At level 15, you'll unlock something new, the enhancement slot. These give you a smattering of weapons-based passive improvements, as well as having a specific way they'll change one manufacturer's guns. These can get quite powerful, and in some cases can entirely change how certain weapons work. Well worth looking out for these. At level 20, you'll unlock the classic class mod slot. These work very similarly to how they used to, except they seem to contribute more points on average to skills, and they often have quite a few extra passive effects. It seems like these are simply more powerful than they used to be, and legendary ones come with serious changes to your class. The class aspect has been changed a bit as well. There are currently 4 characters to pick from, with another 2 coming later. I chose Vex the Siren because that's just who I am. You have 3 skill trees per character, each one topped by a different action skill. So you have these 3 different active skills to choose from, and you can also splash points into other trees even if you're using a different skill. Your active skill also has 2 slots under it. As you put points into the tree, it'll unlock further tiers of passives until you reach the part where it splits into 3 down there. They progress individually. At different tiers, you'll unlock these augments. You can slot one into the first slot below your skill. These change significant aspects of how that character and skill work, and you can slot any one of them in at any time without more points once you've unlocked the tier that they're on. At the very bottom are the things that go in the second slot under the augment, which are called capstones. These take a while to reach, but they massively change how the active skill works and are extremely powerful. There's a significant amount of build diversity for each character now, and all the augments and capstones means that your choices can create something that's a complete blast to play. You can also respec at these stations you find around the place, but it's quite expensive to do so, more so for every point you add, but it's also very easy to make a lot of money, so you'll be able to respec whenever you want, basically. By the way, vending machines actually can have pretty good stuff now. I found some good guns from them, and I even bought a legendary class mod from one once. You have 4 weapon slots, and there's quite a bit new here too. They shelved a few of the manufacturers, like Dahl, for instance, and they've added 3 new ones. Order weapons can charge up multiple shots into one big one. Ripper gear charges up for full auto, and even their shotguns and sniper rifles do this, and they also look partially organic. And dataless weapons are basically Tau weapons from 40k. They are very futuristic looking and meant to be reliable and accurate. They also have a mode switch secondary that uses a different ammo type, so say an assault rifle that turns into a shotgun. All the existing manufacturers have received a refresh on what they can do, and there's now an absurd variety of gun types and secondaries. Want an SMG that can fire salvos of mini rockets? How about a shotgun that can launch an explosive nuclear fuel rod? Sniper rifles with underbarrel railguns, assault rifles with giant seeking missiles, or even a repeater with dual underbarrel flintlocks. Not only are the appearance, reloads, firing feel, and secondary options more massively varied than ever, but legendary guns tend to have completely ridiculous effects that you can't find anywhere else. A super cool addition is the new licensed part system. Generally, when you find a gun in these games, the manufacturer represents the whole weapon. All of its parts are from the same company. Now, though, you can find weapons by one company that has all the trappings of a weapon from them, except it also has a licensed part from someone else that alters it in some way. Maybe you have a Jacobs sniper rifle, slow firing, creates ricochet at the other enemies, kinetic damage, but it has a Malawan magazine, which overwrites the normal damage and gives you 2 different elemental types you can switch between. Guns can have no one or multiple licensed parts, which takes the already obscene number of guns and gives it even more possible variation. I would say that because of all this, the shooting and looting are more fun than ever. If you enjoy that part of these games as much as I do, this scratches that same itch in new and exciting ways. But of course, what use are guns if you don't have enemies to shoot them at? The enemy variety this time around is pretty fantastic. There are several factions to fight against, and they'll even fight each other sometimes. I really like that there are friendly NPCs that'll actually fight with you. Capturing a base makes a ton of people move in to defend it, which feels pretty awesome. A world can feel much more alive if there are people in it that seem to want it to be safer. The common crazy person enemies are called Rippers this time around. They have a lot more militarized gear this time and don't feel quite as makeshift as these factions did in previous games. Their elites can be a real problem, using powerful weapons and having the ability to spawn various turrets and supports that can deal suddenly massive damage. There's also the Order. They consist of synths that tend to have shields and armor instead of health. They come in many shapes and sizes. The flying dudes are a real problem, and the elite versions have lots of supportive powers to make fighting their army more challenging. Both factions also have big dudes, like bulkheads, big, beefy, heavy armor having tanks, complete with strong projectiles and nasty melee charges. There's also the Animal faction, which has seen the threat and number of them beefed up. Huge charging beasts ready to shove their horns in places you'd rather they didn't. Flying critters with some nasty acid stuff going on. Big serpentine threshers that lurk underground and pop up to say hi. Creeps, which are strange engineered plant-like zergling things. And even more aside from that, like the pangolins, which are not quite like their earthly counterparts, at least I don't think. You can also bet that each and every one of these factions and beast types have many different variations of enemies in them that provide loads of combat variety and fun threats to deal with. They really went all out when it comes to providing huge numbers of different things they want to kill you. There are also badasses to deal with, Borderlands elite enemy types. There's a lot more different kinds of them now, and some of them are pretty mean. They all have their own unique things to look out for, and many enemy types have a badass variant now that significantly enhances their threat level. Badass versions of the Order's flying dudes and their drones can bring the fight to a complete stop as they buff everyone and start sending massive numbers of bomb drones and explosive projectiles your way. You also fight more of them in general than the previous games. Most encounters will have at least one. It's also common to see some fights, especially the larger bases and radio tower takeover defense missions, spawn like 3 or 4 of them once for you to contend with. Sometimes, while exploring around and listening to your 2112 Rush mixtape, you'll come across these bubbles of energy surrounding certain areas. These are world bosses, and they spawn the second you step into the bubble. No one can shoot out of or into the bubble, but once you're in, a pretty tough battle will start. There are many different world bosses to encounter. They usually have 2 or 3 large health gauges and some nasty abilities that no one else has. They kind of have a gimmick, sort of, that you need to spot and get used to in order to beat them due to their high damage and constantly spawning adds. But once you do, they explode in a wonderful shower of loot and seem to have pretty high drop rates for epics and legendaries. The only real annoying thing here is that the bubble stays in place, and if you walk out of the bubble while fighting, even for just like half a millisecond, it will instantly despawn the world boss and you'll lose all your progress on it. I think maybe the bubble should be a little bit bigger once you step into it, considering how mobile you are, because constantly despawning the boss every time you move backwards too much is annoying. As for story bosses, there are plenty of those to face off against. They get quite hard, in my opinion. They've been really fun fights so far, as they have lots of health to whittle down and plenty of unique attacks to learn. They don't really fight like anything else. In the story, there are 3 big, huge fights that cap off each biome on the map. Super important people, that's your number 1 target there. They take many missions of helping factions in advancing that area's story to reach, and their fights are really long and super hard with multiple phases and specific gimmicks you have to deal with in order to even damage them at all. It feels incredibly rewarding to down one of these, and completing the complex dance necessary to do so reminds me a bit of MMO raiding. Due to all the various dungeons scattered around the place, some story-specific, some side mission content, they implemented a sort of re-roll for the areas, basically. After you complete one of these, there'll be a machine at the start called a Moxie's Big Encore. You can pay usually like low 5-digit amounts of money and pull the lever to respawn the whole thing. All the enemies will come back, the scripting will work as if you just found it, and the boss or bosses will respawn, letting you do that whole dungeon again as if it was the first time, except with enemy levels and rewards scaled to your current level. The side stuff in this game is actually really good usually. There are plenty of side missions you'll find around, and they have all sorts of bizarre characters and situations to deal with. Some of them will be quest chains, some are one-offs, and they tend to take you to previously locked areas or spawn new challenges to face. They never seem to be repetitive or basic tasks like fetch quests. If one starts that way and seems like one, it'll probably change to something unexpected halfway through and activate some new scripting you haven't seen yet. It's hard to consider the side content boring and samey when it often takes you to new places and has you doing unique things you don't do anywhere else, or fighting a boss you wouldn't have otherwise seen. The contract board quests are more like your typical open world generated quests, things like killing 10 of this enemy or gathering 5 of this ingredient. These, however, are all completely optional and are really meant to be accepted from a base and then completed naturally as a little extra when you go do something else. You can tell this by the way that they auto-complete once you do the task, and you don't have to go back to the board or turn it in with an NPC. All missions, main and side content, will also drop some rewards off in your inventory. You can see a rewards tab when you open it. You just click on this and then the various mission rewards to accept them, often having certain rarity weapons and cosmetics to redeem. In the previous games, you could go to a station thing called a catch-a-ride and spawn vehicles to help you go through the larger areas. This time around, you have a personal vehicle that you can just hit a button and spawn anywhere. This makes sense as a change for an open world experience, and it handles pretty well. It hovers, so it moves very smoothly. If it gets destroyed, it just goes on cooldown for a few, and you can respawn it easily after that. There is one part of it that annoys the crap out of me, though. You have a GPS-like function, like many open world games. You just hit a key, and your adorable drone will fly out and scan the environment, as well as giving you a nice line in the air to follow to whatever you're currently tracking. You can even track 2 missions at once, and it'll split the line into 2 different colors. However, for some ungodly reason, it only works on foot. You can't summon the line while driving, the time you would most want to do it. You can hop off, scan, and then hop back on, but that takes a few because of the animations and the fact that it goes on cooldown for like 5 seconds when you hop off of it. The line vanishes after like 15 or 20 seconds, so that's just not going to work. It doesn't really make sense to me that you can't use the navigation aid while navigating. There's a really robust system of cosmetics, which I really like. You have a whole cosmetic menu that lets you change several things about your character, your drone buddy, your vehicle, and even apply skins to individual weapons. Somewhat weirdly, you can also change the engine on your bike in this menu, but that actually has noticeable stat differences. Everything else you can do here is purely cosmetic. You can earn new cosmetics in color schemes by playing and completing challenges, as well as these drilling platforms that are like a sort of platforming puzzle. Yeah, earning your cosmetics by playing the game. Imagine that. As for the story and characters, I'm not going to spoil things, but there is kind of an important theme here, I feel. After 3's story and writing were kind of garbage, and the whole game just seems to hate the player and all of its characters and was weirdly cruel to everyone, this game seems to want to reset back to how things felt in Borderlands 2. The writing feels significantly closer to that game than any other entry, and I certainly don't mind that. Borderlands 3 was almost like a flanderized version of the usual vibe. Everything was amplified to silly levels for no reason. Claptrap was far more obnoxious than usual. The character moments were way more cruel than needed, and it was constantly trying to make everything into a joke. When your game wants to make literally everything a joke, it feels like no character cares about the story and nothing that happens matters. A good game that is trying to mix in some humor knows when to not be funny. If you make everything a joke, it just feels so hollow and cynical and like nobody cares about anything. The characters in this game know how to make a joke, but they also know when to be serious, and how those moments should affect things going forward because they actually matter and not everything needs to try and be funny. I really liked the writing thus far. Vex is funny and cool in a kind of hiding your nerdiness sort of way. The friendly characters like Rush and Conway have great chemistry as friends in an awful situation, and even the villains get a fair amount of characterization as well, turning them into legitimate feeling threats with some serious problems. There's an interesting dichotomy going on, where you have an overarching goal of finding out what happened to Lilith at the end of the last game. But then you run into this planet and an entity called the Timekeeper, who seems ultra powerful and has the whole thing under his thrall, which means you gotta split your intentions and also have an overarching goal of trying to free this place and its inhabitants from an immortal weirdo. I'm a fan of plots where the villain is so distant from happenings and so untouchable that it almost doesn't seem possible at first to take them down. But then you work your way through their elite lackeys and start to see the discord and the corruption, and by the end, you realize that they're basically just like you, and you can actually change things for the better. Settling the writing back down to the less constantly absurd levels of 2, and even 1 sometimes, was a great move, in my opinion. It gives way more room for expressive allies and enemies with human moments, and some actual drama that isn't just trying to be needlessly cruel and ironic. While plenty of people can still be annoyed by the writing because of the fart jokes and maybe they don't gel with the playable cast, I already know this series isn't for everyone, and I'm okay with that because nothing is. At the very least, I think the quality of the writing is a significant leg up over the last game, and the nice character moments and fun writing of Vex are enough for me to enjoy myself. Borderlands will always be a series with a special place for me. I remember showing up to a GameStop on release day for the first game and grabbing a 360 copy. I also had this delicious cherry popcorn that a good friend at school gave me from her work, and I remember munching on it while discovering this series from the beginning. When 3 came out, I realized that I loved the gameplay, but the world, characters, and writing were all suffering in ways that convinced me this series might not be for me anymore. So the fact that 4 is so incredibly fun and actually has writing this time makes me so happy to see. It's still unacceptable in my opinion to release the game in such a technically messy state, and although the patches deployed so far have done a good amount to alleviate that mess, it still isn't fully fixed up. I want to recommend this game wholeheartedly because it's a true blast, and such an unexpected improvement that it makes me very interested in what they'll cook up for the DLC later. However, I have to temper that feeling because if I suggested that someone go out and buy a $70 game when their machine might not even be able to play it correctly, that would kind of make me a clueless idiot. I try to be as consumer friendly as I can on this channel. I want people to feel like they can trust what I say, whether they agree with me or not. Because I don't make reckless statements like that, and I prioritize the rights of the player not to feel scammed. So here's what I'll say. I heartily recommend this game as an excellent ARPG if you're a fan of looter shooters and the like, but only if you do the extra research to find others with a very similar PC to yours and see how they've been posting what works for them. This is one of those games that requires some extra research. Watching a single review and just buying it straight away might not be a good idea. If you are convinced that you'll actually be able to enjoy it, this is a fantastic experience, but you should probably search around a little for other opinions and also keep an eye on the big updates coming soon, which are supposed to be a big help for performance. Unless you play on console, I guess. In that case, it just plays how it plays and you deal with it. I guess it probably runs much more consistently due to the static hardware, so in that case, yeah, I feel good about recommending it. I'll put the Steam page down below if you'd like. It's not an affiliate link or anything. Thanks a ton for making it through this long-ass video, and I'll see you next time.